If we all want to mute, it'll help us hear the sound of Barry and Adrian presenting their recipe.
Okay, are you ready for us to start?
Yes, please.
Okay, Barry.
Welcome to this morning's Kolot Kehilla with Mark Copelovitch. And in honor of his presentation, we have a German and Canadian inspired brunch. Mark did a sabbatical in Germany, and his book highlights some Canadian and German banking experiences. So this morning, we are having a lox Benny on pumpernickel bread. Adrian is a wonderful baker, and this is our third attempt at pumpernickel and by far our best. I understand now why they put mashed potatoes in the recipe. The texture is much different. The lox Benny has a base of the pumpernickel smeared with cream cheese, a large generous portion of lox. If you desire onion and tomato, perhaps cucumber, topped with a white sauce, which is a caper dill sauce, and garnished with some scallions and dill.
You can show them on the video.
Here's our ingredients for our lox Benny, except for the poached egg, which comes on nice and warm right at the end before you're ready to eat. We're also having some side dishes, which are a German and Canadian influence. One is poutine with using German fried potatoes rather than French fries. And this poutine is a vegetarian poutine made with a vegetable broth rather than a beef gravy from your standing rib roast. So if you're using it for a fleischidig meal, it does taste better with the beef gravy.
But not the...
But it's not bad.
What about the cheddar cheese on top of it?
Well, you have to either use ersatz soy tofu cheese or something, or leave the cheese off your recipe. We also have some German-inspired side dishes. One is currywurst, which is this one is made with a vegan brat sausage and a curry powder and tomato base. We also have a traditional German beet salad with caraway and cloves. This is actually quite good. Some cucumber salad with a sour cream and dill dressing. For dessert, we have a maple-filled cinnamon roll glazed with a maple frosting. On the side, when we tear it apart, we have some maple butter. And we also have an maple apple compote, where the sweetener is maple syrup rather than any sugar. I don't know how many of you have tried the recipes, which are available from the link to the show, but definitely worth trying. And if you haven't made pumpernickel bread before, you might give it a try. This is really a delightful surprise.
Barry, was it easy to get all of the ingredients for this one?
The only ingredient in the pumpernickel bread that might be difficult for you to find is charmuska, which is actually an Indian seed, but is traditional in Russian pumpernickel.
Penzies does have it.
Penzies carries it. Otherwise, everything I believe is readily available.
And which one was the hardest for you guys to pull together and make it taste what you thought would be good and palatable?
I believe the currywurst. I'm not really into curries, and my first attempt with the curry powder recipe that I came up with really didn't leave this as being very desirable. It tastes much better today with Adrian's recipe, which has some more of an Indian curry with the spices that she chose to use.
This was one of the rare times that I've tasted something that used spice that wasn't really good, because you're usually very good with spices, but this was not
The
good.
first one was a disaster.
Yes.
So you might have to work with your curry blend, especially since it's got a tomato base, and not all of the curry powders really balance well with the tomato.
Yeah. You could tell them about this is the third attempt we had with the.
This is the third attempt with the pumpernickel, and it's the best one. I'm not really a baker, as my wife can attest. She's the bread maker in our family. But this pumpernickel today really turned out well. And this, I didn't realize until we were exploring the recipes that there's cocoa powder in pumpernickel. You have to use a dark rye flour and cocoa powder to get the color.
But mashed potato.
This one has a cup of mashed potato in the dough, which really makes it a much smoother texture to the bread. If you like a more of a crusty bread with a coarser texture, leave the mashed potatoes out. We have here all the ingredients for our Benny. If one does not desire to have an egg, one can just have lox on pumpernickel. We have our pumpernickel, red onion, tomato, cream cheese, cucumber, lox, and this is our caper dill sauce. And you're going to want to put that on your poached egg right before you're ready to eat it. Otherwise, it tends to solidify. Same thing.
Barry, Jordan Allenberg is actually having a bagel with 2 eggs, Penzeys toasted onion and shaved Parmesan and maple syrup. So he's doing an ode to you. And Betsy Rodeman says that this is from a different region of Germany than where she had lived. And she said currywurst to her is like the best. She really likes it, and she eats it with a toothpick.
Does she eat the vegetarian variety, or does she eat the actual meat variety?
Let's see. And actually, it was Chezi. I sit corrected. It was Chezi telling us that, who lived in Germany and who knows these foods. And he also loves German pumpernickel.
You go in the German supermarkets, it's actually hard to find ketchup, but you'll find 20 varieties of the curry sauce, the curry ketchup sauce.
Well, we like to try things that we haven't explored before. And definitely, I've looked at poutine and people having it in restaurants and said, I'll never taste that. And we did try it, and it's not bad. The German fried potatoes
are good.
Are really good. Better than French fries for this dish.
Yeah.
Okay, it looks simply lovely, and you guys get to eat and enjoy the fruits of your labor after the presentation. But let's go on, and if you, Barry, could introduce our featured speaker, Mark Copelovitch, that would be amazing.
Well, I think Mark is well known to many of the congregants at Beth Israel, serving in a variety of roles with the show, but he's a professor in political science at the University of Wisconsin, and he's an expert on finance and the economics of the world. Today, he's going to talk to us about his new book, which has to do with banking crises and what we've done since 2007 to get around having a next banking crisis and whether that's going to work again. I understand he's personal friends with the Russian oligarchs who supplied the money to be laundered through the Deutsche Bank for our president. and maybe he'll get into some of that today. Welcome to Mark Copelovitch, and we're ready for him to start his presentation. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to Barry and Adrian Yasher Koach. Truly impressive spread. I think the only thing missing was a Montreal bagel and some herring, but very, very impressive. Can everyone hear me and see the slide? Good. I will assume that you can. So, well, great. It's great to see so many people here and to not be talking about board budgets or ritual committee items and something that I actually have more expertise in. So, what I'm going to talk about today is financial crises, why they keep happening or not, and what should we do about them or not. So you're looking at various pictures about the 2008 crisis, the European financial crisis of the last decade. But the two images here that I'll just kind of flag your attention to because they're relevant to the book and what I'm going to talk about is the bottom left, which is the German banking crisis of 1931. And that's a bank run on one of the banks in Berlin. Then that is a picture actually of the headquarters of the Bank of Canada, the Central Bank of Canada. And Canada is one of the most fascinating cases because they're one of the only industrialized countries never to have a systemic banking crisis. And so I will come back to that as I talk. All right, so I want to do three things. The first one is give you a sense of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about financial crises and put that in the context of the world economy as it is today and the global financial system. So we are living in an era of unprecedented financial globalization. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and what we mean when we talk about the global financial system. And then the enormous economic and political cost of financial crises. Right. So in many ways, the defining feature of international relations in the world economy over the last 50 years is this era of financial globalization that we live in. Right. So we hear a lot in the news about the rise of China, the end of the Cold War, all of the kind of big political and economic events of the last 50 years are taking in place in the context of what's actually the single most important and defining feature, I think, which is we've moved from a world where there's not a lot of money moving across borders, if you go back to about 1960, to unprecedented levels of money moving across borders. And a lot of the economic and political events and consequences we've seen over the last 5 decades have to do with that fact. So I'll start by talking about that and then talk about the kind of big thing which motivated the research that I've done is why financial crises happen. And so there's a set of usual suspects, which I started looking into along with my co-author. And it turns out that, a lot of the explanations we have about financial crises don't really seem to be great explanations. And so that was kind of the motivation of the book project. I'll talk to you about the argument or what I think is the answer. And then the question you're probably more interested in is, well, as Barry said, what should we do about them so they don't happen again? And then if I have time, there's a little bit that I want to say about the current moment we're in with COVID and the COVID economic crisis, which is not yet a financial crisis, though, as I say here, we're working on it in the sense that it could become one the longer we wait to kind of do something more serious in terms of a policy response. All right, so what do I mean by the global financial system? So this is, a lot of what I'm going to try and do here is give you some pictures and images to help you conceptualize what I'm talking about. This is the massive change that I was just talking about in the world economy over the last 50 years. So you're looking at a chart here of, it's called cross-border financial claims, but you can basically think about it as money moving across borders in the world economy. The jargon for that is capital flows, and I've kind of defined briefly what that is at the bottom there. It's investors, banks, people moving money across borders. You can think about Citibank lending, people buying stocks overseas, government bonds, debt, things like that. And I think it's a really striking chart. right? Especially if you look from about the 1975, where the chart starts, up to 2007. And you see the little bit then of the rollback of globalization. But even where we are in 2018 on this chart, and we're basically in the same place in 2021, a 30-fold increase in the amount of money moving across borders, right? So that is, in many ways, the defining feature of the international system in the world economy is more or less money moves freely across borders now. And as we've seen since 2008, that often has very serious negative consequences for financial stability. All right. This is what that system looks like if we think about where the money is moving to and where the kind of big sites or financial centers are. So I like this chart for a couple of reasons. One is it shows you the network of global finance and which countries are really central to the international financial system in the world economy. And the other is it's a really interesting way to think about countering the conventional wisdom of what you probably hear in the news, which is that China is going to take over the world and the U.S. is declining power and the declining hegemon in the international system. So you see here the U.S. and the U.K., you see the long run and legacy of history of how dominant they are, right? So those circles are basically how much of these flows in the international financial system are cited in a country. And then the lines connecting them is kind of the magnitude of the flows between them. So you see the US, you see the UK, you see a bunch of European countries and Japan. Really the heart of global finance, it's very much still a kind of Euro-Atlantic, US dominated international system. And that's very different than when we talk about international security or you hear about the trade war, right? That kind of the US and China are really on equal par. When we're talking about finance, that's really not the case. You see China over there, China and Hong Kong, not insignificant, but relatively disconnected from the flows of global finance and not really the cause, right, or the major consequence of the financial crises that we've seen since 2008. This is the other thing that I want you to take away before I dive into why crises happen is they have been a constant feature, right? So you're looking here at, sorry, I was just looking at the chat there. You're looking here at the number of crises in a year since 1976 up until 2017. And you see these things happen in waves and clusters, right? And I'm focused in my work on banking crises, but these often go with currency crises, right? So that can be a country's currency will fall by 40 or 50% in the value of its exchange rate very suddenly, or a debt crisis is a government debt or sovereign debt crisis. And these things often cluster together, right? As they have in Europe over the last decade, as they have in Latin America historically. And so you see basically financial crises have been a constant feature of the globalization of finance for the last 40, 50 years. In the 80s, it was Latin America, along with the US. Some of you are probably old enough to remember the failure of Continental Illinois, which at one time was the fourth largest bank in the United States. In the 90s, we had the Asian financial crisis. We had the big spike there was also a crisis in the post-communist transition countries like Poland and Hungary. And then a currency crisis in the forerunner to the Eurozone, where the UK, Italy, Finland, and Sweden had major exchange rate crises that had deep financial implications. And then you see the US and global financial crisis in 2008 and the more recent crises in the Eurozone and Turkey and Venezuela as well. So crises are a constant feature. They go with financial globalization. What really motivated me to start studying this and the book project is that crises happen all the time in an era of financial globalization, but they happen a lot more in some countries than in others. And in some countries, they don't seem to happen at all. Right, so you see Canada and the arrow there. And again, Canada, but also Australia, a couple interesting cases where, you know, in the long run, not just from 1970 to 2012, but going all the way back to where we have data on this into the 19th century, Canada has never had a major financial crisis. Germany, as I'll talk about, was like that up until the 1990s. And suddenly in the last 20 years is as crisis prone as Britain and the United States. And you see Sweden, United States, Spain, Hungary, there's a series of countries that very frequently over the last 50 years have had financial crises. So that's kind of the puzzle motivating this, is why do these things happen in some countries and not in others? And you might say, so what? This is kind of a technical topic, but I will try and convince you that it's really important for at least a couple reasons. One is these things are enormously costly, as you already probably know. So this is one way to think about the economic cost of financial crises. So on the left here, you're looking at a chart from some researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And they were trying a couple years ago to estimate how costly was the financial crisis that we had in 2008 to 2010. And what you're looking at here is real gross domestic product. So that's the overall size of the US economy, controlling for inflation. And the line there, the straight line, is the trend line from World War II onward. Right? So if you basically say, we know the economy on average over the long run grows between probably about 2 to 4% a year. The trend line, if we hadn't had a crisis in 2008, would have been there. That's how big the US economy would be. And then you see those other lines are the actual, right? And you see that we kept falling away from the trend line the longer the crisis and the Great Recession went on. And the estimate from this paper, and some other papers have backed this up as well, is that that loss in overall output in the US economy represents basically $70,000 for every person in the country. Right. So now we know that's not evenly distributed. One of the other things we know about financial crises is the effects of them are very unevenly distributed, and they make inequality worse. But if you average it out, right, all of us lost about $70,000 in lifetime earnings from this crisis, and we're probably never going to get it back. Right. So that's one way to just kind of think about how costly are big financial crises. The other is to look at the chart on the right, where you're thinking about the fiscal cost, which is how much does the government spend to rescue the banking system, to provide unemployment insurance, to do all the sorts of policies that we talk about the government doing when there's a recession or a financial crisis. And the estimates there that's on the order of 5 to 15% of gross domestic product. So these things are enormously costly in economic terms, which makes them important. But as you know, I'm a political scientist, not an economist. I kind of work at the intersection of these things. But the things that I find the most interesting actually are the political effects. Right? And so the so what on that side is, if anything, the political effects are worse and more serious than the economic effects. So this is just a little bit from one paper that I think is among the most important studies that we've seen in the wake of the financial crisis in my corner of the world. So it's a set of German colleagues of mine, Funke, Schlerik, and Trebisch, have a paper called The Political Aftermath of Financial Crises. And what they've done is they've looked at 160 years of data and 800 elections, basically in the kind of advanced industrialized countries. And you see the list here. And they're looking at the more than 100 financial crises that have occurred in this period, trying to understand in the long run, what are the political effects of crises? And these are the three big things, right? So one is, and this will sound familiar, we see hard right turns. So in the wake of banking and financial crises, right-wing parties, and especially the far right, benefit the most politically, right, and electorally. The second is the bums get thrown out of office, right? So governing becomes more difficult. Governments lose seats. You get coalitions fracture. The center of politics kind of gets hollowed out. And the thing that's really interesting, and why I think this is such an important paper, is these colleagues of mine have looked at other types of economic downturns. So just kind of, sometimes you have a recession and you don't have not caused by a financial crisis. They don't find these effects when you don't have a financial crisis. So it really seems to be something different about the political effects of banking and financial crises. Now, for those of you that are statistically inclined, these are what the marginal effects look like from their statistical analysis. So if you're not statistically inclined, I'll try and explain quickly what you're looking at here. You're looking at the estimates. If you look on the horizontal x-axis here, you see the years since the start of a financial crisis. So the 5 years after a financial crisis. And on the y-axis, you're looking at the estimated percent of change in vote shares in the elections in the countries in this sample. right? So 20 countries, 150 years, 800 elections. And basically what do you find? Again, you see in the 5 years after a financial crisis, somewhere on the order of a 5 to 35% increase in the vote share for far right parties. Right. So who are we talking about? We're talking about the Nazis. We're talking about the PIS in Poland, the Alternative for Germany today in Germany, the Brexit Party in the UK, those sorts of things. If you look down at the bottom, you see the government losing somewhere between 2 and 10% of the vote share and the opposition gaining votes. So again, the political effects here, these things are really big. Just to kind of make that a little more concrete, this is what that hard right turn looks like around the world, at least across the two sides of the Atlantic. But you also see this with Bolsonaro in Brazil and populist leaders elsewhere like Modi in India. So there's a hard right turn, right? What have we seen since 2008? Pretty much around the world, right? You have seen far right authoritarian populist parties come to power. You're looking pictures here. You see Geert Wilders from the Netherlands, Matteo Salvini from Italy, Jörg Meuthen, the Alternative for Deutschland party leader, and Marine Le Pen in France. And then you have Donald and Nigel Farage from the UK Independence Party, the pro-Brexit party. So you see, like around the world over the last 12 years, there's been a massive move to the right. And I think that's not a coincidence. The last time we saw such a wave like this was in the interwar period in the wake of the Great Depression. The other thing you see is the hollowing out of the middle, and in particular, the collapse of the center left. So the chart you're looking here, I think this is a really informative chart. I spend a lot of time studying European politics. This is looking at the Social Democratic or center left party's share of the votes in European elections. And you basically look at 1970 and say, all right, like what percentage of the votes did all of the social democratic parties in Western Europe have? Let's call that 100%. And then let's see going forward, do they kind of go up or below that? And you see a bunch of big events in European and world politics here. The big thing is the right end of the chart, right? So look since 2007, when the financial crisis hit, when the center left was very ascendant actually in European politics, the center left has been devastated, right? Pick a European country and the equivalent of the Democratic Party in that country has been thrown out of office and lost about 20% of its vote share. So that is a feature of politics, and we see exactly the same pattern in the United States. So this isn't quite a great, well illustrated chart, but it's the best I could find to get the point across. If you look at the Senate, the House, state legislatures, and governors across the country since 2008, the Democrats have been devastated, right? So with the exception of the 2018 election, the kind of across the board wave of the Democrats getting thrown out of office very closely mirrors this pattern that we see in Europe. So along with the hard right turn, right, where are those votes coming from? A big chunk of those votes is actually coming from people abandoning the center left. Now, before I get into the why crises happen, the last thing about the political effects is this is a pattern again that we see historically. So what you're looking at here is German elections in the interwar era in 1928 and 1932. And remember, the Great Depression and the German banking crisis of 1931 are right in the middle of these two things. So what do you see? You basically see the results of these exact same patterns. The Nazis went from less than 3% of the vote to the largest number of votes, 37% of the vote from 28 to 93. And you ask yourself, well, where did those votes come from? Right. Well, one place they came from is the SPD or Social Democrats. So the forerunner of the current SPD, kind of the rough equivalent of what we would think of as the center-left Democratic Party, they lost 8% of their votes. You see the far left, the communists got a small share of the votes, but the big chunk came from the Social Democrats and then the Three People's Parties, which are the forerunners of the modern Christian Democrats. That is basically the center-right party in Germany. So this is an old pattern, right? And it's a long and enduring pattern, which is when you have financial crises, they're very expensive economically. And they also lead to more extreme politics, right? They lead to the collapse of the center, the hollowing out of moderate governments, and the rise of far-right authoritarian parties. So that's the kind of unhappy news on the political side of financial crises. All right, so that's kind of all background for what the book is about, and what my research has been about is what causes financial crises. And before I dive into my argument, these are the usual suspects, right? So depending on your age demographic here, when you hear usual suspects, you either think about the picture on the top right, if you're me, or if you're a little bit older, you think about the picture on the bottom right. But the usual suspects are the three you kind of see on the text here. And this is really what motivated my research, which is these are the answers. If you ask most economists, right, and most scholars, what caused financial crises, these are the things that you'll hear, right? In particular, the first one, which is those large capital inflows, that money moving across borders is what causes financial crises. And the second bullet here kind of tells you the step-by-step of why that happens, right? So you have a ton of money coming across borders into a country. It goes into financial markets, it goes to banks, then you get a big credit boom of banks lending out that money. You get an asset bubble. This may sound familiar. Think about the housing market, subprime mortgages and things like that in 2005, 6, 7, and 8. And then things start to go wrong. You get bank failures, and then if enough banks fail, you get a big financial crisis. And that theme of capital inflows causing financial crises is related to a lot of the other causes, where you kind of hear vaguely globalization is the cause, or low interest rates, or government debt and deficits. Those are actually kind of all symptoms of money flowing across borders into countries. So that's the big one, right? But there's a couple other ones that you hear as well. You often hear, well, regulation was weak or lax, right? And so we wouldn't have had a financial crisis if we regulated better, which is true, but it's kind of a tautology. Right, it's easy to look back and basically say, since we had a financial crisis, we know that the regulation must have been bad. It's a lot harder in the moment or in advance to say, well, this is the thing that we need to regulate better. And I'll actually come back to that towards the end of the talk when I talk about what policy solutions, right? We're always fighting the last war and trying to figure out what comes next. And so that comes into the regulatory argument. The other one is financial innovation. Right. So the other thing you've probably heard over time of what caused the 2008 crisis was all kinds of fancy, complex securities, derivatives, collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, things like that. And so financial innovation, or kind of banks and investors doing funky things with complex securities, is a cause of financial crises. But that usually actually, again, is a consequence of the large capital inflows. So those are the usual suspects, right? And so when I started thinking, when I was sitting in Berlin in 2013 and talking to my co-author and thinking about, all right, we're going to write a book on financial crises. Do we need to write this book? The reason why is we started to think, you know what, we're not convinced by these explanations. So before I get into exactly why we're not convinced, just a quick National Accounting 101 to clear up some concepts that I'm going to talk about. So what are you looking at here? You're looking at the US economy as a whole, the balance sheet. For those of you familiar with accounting, the two sides of the balance sheet of the US, if we thought about the US, kind of like a company as a country, right? And so you have what are known as the current account and the capital account. So look on the bottom. It's the current account, which is the trade deficit plus the government deficit. Okay, so that's the exports minus imports. Exports, how much we sell to the rest of the country. Imports, how much we buy from the rest of the country, plus government spending. And you basically see over time, since the 1980s, the US has run wider and wider current account deficits. Big trade deficits, as Donald Trump likes to talk about with the trade war, as well as the government borrowing and running big deficits. Where does that money come from, right? How can we buy more from the rest of the world than we sell, and the government can spend more than it brings in tax revenue? That's the other side, right? The capital account surplus. The quick answer and the necessary answer when you think about a country is you have to borrow it from the rest of the world. Okay, and so these things are mirror images. The capital account surplus is financial inflows minus outflows. So if we're running a current account deficit, and we're spending more income than we have, we are by definition borrowing it from the other, from the rest of the world. And that ties back to what I was talking about on the last slide. When you think about large capital inflows cause financial crises, a large capital inflow is measured as either as a capital account surplus or a current account deficit, right? So very briefly, what to take away from this slide is an enormous amount of money has been flowing into the US, unprecedented levels since the 1990s. Now, the problem with that argument that it's about capital flows or regulation or things like that is those usual suspect explanations predict about 20 of the last 5 crises. So you're looking at a chart here from the book, and you can read about what one of these box and whisker graphs looks like. The takeaway here very briefly is that basically when you look at current account deficits or capital account surpluses, that more or less, there's not a lot of variation between the countries that do have crises and the countries that don't, right? So you can kind of think about those as it's a necessary, but not a Josh Garoon, yes, the usual suspects are Marxists, exactly. You can see that basically the amount of money flowing into countries that do have financial crises is not very different from the amount of money that flows into countries that don't have financial crises, right? And I'm going to make that a little more concrete here, looking at 3 countries, the 2 I talk about in the book, as well as the one we care about the most, which is the United States. So these are those current account balances over the last 40 years for the US, for Canada, and Germany, right? And so if capital inflows, right, current account deficits, were the cause of financial crises, there's no reason why Canada would never have a financial crisis, because basically they have the same level of current account deficits that the US has. And this is true if you go back all the way to about the 1870s, right? On the flip side, you see the black line there, which is Germany. Germany was like Canada, never having a financial crisis from the 1870s up until the 1990s. It's only in the era when it's running massive current account surpluses, which actually means there's net money flowing out of Germany in terms of capital. It's only since then that they've started having financial crises. So this again was the motivation for the book of, right, the explanation is incomplete. We need something else, because we wouldn't see these patterns in the data if the usual suspects were providing the right answers. All right. So if not the usual suspects, who is Kaiser Sose? Kaiser Sose is the gentleman you're looking at there is one of my best friends from graduate school. It's David Singer. He's a professor of political science at MIT and the co-author on the book with me. So what we did with this book is to try and find a better answer, try and explain these puzzles that don't seem to be answered by the existing explanations. And, you know, this is for the next few slides, I'm going to get a little bit in the weeds. So if you want to go get a cup of coffee and you don't want the boring details, this is the Cliff's Notes version. Right? So why is it that these capital inflows only sometimes cause banking crises? It has to do with the structure of the domestic financial system, right? And very specifically, it has to do with whether or not a country has large securities markets, large stock and bond markets, and some of those other fancy financial instruments. When banks are operating in an environment like that, which is like the United States or the United Kingdom, countries of that sort, that is when banks are more likely to take on risk and banking crises are more likely to occur. Right, and I'll show you a little bit of statistical evidence about that. But this is why we arrived then at talking about Canada and Germany, which are countries that didn't fit that mold, right? So Canada does not have large and deep securities markets. Germany didn't either until the 1980s, and now they do, right? So most of the book is actually 2 long historical case studies about why it is that Canada and Germany turned out that way, which was very different from the way the US turned out, where starting in the 1890s or 1900s, the US started developing very large, complicated securities markets. And that pattern has continued over the last 120 years now. So that's very briefly the Cliff's Notes version. And again, why should you care about this? Well, those financial crises are very costly. So if we can figure out why they happen or why they don't, that informs the policy view of what we can do about them. And kind of related to that, as I'll come back to at the end, a lot of what you read in the news or hear from politicians about what we should do in the United States in particular, unfortunately won't help and might actually make things worse. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat here as I assume COVID knew. Any reaction from bankers and policymakers? A couple, Hank. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. All right, this is the slightly longer version. I'm going to try and make this very quick because I want to make sure we have time for questions and get to some of the policy stuff. So why is it that banks might behave differently in a country like the United States, where there are large and complex securities markets, than they do in Canada, where there's not, right? And it has to do with competition and the role that banks play in a financial system. Okay? So banks are what are known as intermediaries, right? Banks are basically how money goes from savers to borrowers in an economy, right? You and I put our money in the bank, and the bank actually lends out most of that money, right? The dirty secret I remember learning when I went into the bank with my dad when I was about 4 years old, and it was still like a big old building where you could see the vault, was that none of the money was there, right? Because the bank takes your money and they only hold on to about 10% of it, and they lend the rest out to everybody else, right? And sometimes banks have a monopoly on that role, but other times savers can put their money direct into financial markets and companies can access them, and they don't need banks, right? And this is kind of a good illustration of that, of what's known as the role of banks versus the role of securities markets. The jargon for that would be indirect versus direct financing. And you can see in the flow chart here, savers, whether that's you and me, households, firms, government, giving money to banks, and then banks channeling that money, right, to borrowers and spenders. Right? But the alternative model is that you and I go directly and invest in the stock market, right, or in the bond market, and that money goes directly to companies in particular, and you can bypass the banks, and you don't need banks. So the short version is, when banks face competition for business in their role as intermediaries, because there are large securities markets, they may behave differently, right? And this, kind of think about what that might look like. So imagine a world in which there are tiny or basically no securities markets. Banks give out loans and they hold onto them for a long time. And since they're going to hold on to those loans for a long time, they have strong incentives to be very careful about who they lend to. Right. And the way to think about that in the United States is the way housing finance used to be, which is 30-year fixed rate mortgages. Right. So most people, I think, here today have at one point had a long-term fixed rate mortgage. And remember what it's like when you buy a house. Right. You go in and the banks basically look through all of your books as a human being and basically say, is this person a safe enough investment to give money to? Right. And so bank lending in that environment can be very profitable. It's not very risky. It's kind of a nice conservative, business. Securities markets in isolation are kind of the polar opposite of that, right? If basically people can throw money into stocks or bonds, and firms can access capital from people who can very quickly buy and sell stocks and bonds, neither side has a whole lot of incentive to be all that careful, right? So if I'm an investor, I buy stocks. If something bad happens, I sell them quickly. I'm not sitting around with somebody's asset on my books for 30 years. And so in securities markets, you tend to think of investors are a lot more risk acceptant, and there's less incentives to monitor. Right? And what we want to argue, and what I think we show, is that when banks face competition for firm business from securities markets, they start to act more risky in their bank lending, and they get involved in the securities markets themselves. And sometimes that makes things go wrong. All right. So the conservative bias of banks erodes, and there's a bunch of ways that can happen. Right. So if I'm facing competition as a bank for firms' business, because firms can go directly to stock markets, I might lend to more riskier borrowers. I might hold less capital or keep less money in that bank vault in case something goes wrong. And I might want to get in on some of that securities action, right? That's what happened in the US in the 2000s of banks starting to buy and invest in mortgage-backed securities and underwrite mortgage-backed securities. So the big implication is that banks are going to behave more risky in a financial system like the United States than they will in a financial system like Canada. That's kind of the general pattern, right? Now, how might we think about measuring that? This is a little technical, but this is kind of from the book, is what's a good number to give us a sense of, well, like how developed are securities markets in a country? And the thing we use in our research is the market bank ratio, which very simply, it's basically how large are stock markets relative to the amount of bank lending in an economy. And what you see here, what you see here is countries like the US and Sweden and Switzerland, massive securities markets relative to bank lending. And then you see countries at the other end of the scale are very small. And then you see there's kind of a cluster somewhere in the middle. So a couple things. One is the US is a huge outlier. But you see other countries with large securities markets like Korea, like Finland, like Sweden, in particular, many of the countries that have had a lot of financial crises over the last 50 years, right? So that's kind of the key variable, right? And the argument we're going to make here in the book is those capital flows are a lot more likely to cause financial crises when they're flowing into systems like the United States, as opposed to when they're flowing into a system like a Canada. Look in the chat here, sorry. Sally, hedge funds. Yes, so you can think about hedge funds are part of the development of securities markets, right? So they are non-bank institutions. And the more credit that's throwing through hedge funds, they're making those risky type of investments. So kind of exactly the sorts of things. A country like the US, where you have this large market bank ratio, a lot of that is going to be things like hedge funds. Livia, I will answer your question no, specifically in about 5 minutes or so. Are Finland and Sweden outliers? The US is an outlier, right? I would think Finland and Sweden, if you look at this as a distribution, Lou, you know, really from about New Zealand up to Switzerland is really the distribution, and Austria and below in the US are kind of outliers. So they're kind of at the, oh, you mean in terms of crises? They're at the high end. They're not outliers, right? So I just got looking through the chat here. Are there ways, Jordan, changing structure to a robust banking system? Jordan, let me come back to that, okay? That's a good question. I have
There's other longer questions, Mark, earlier, and we can come back to them.
I will come back to those. All right. So very quickly, for those of you that are statistically inclined, this is a marginal effects chart here. This is the conditional effect of capital inflows on the probability of a banking crisis by the market bank ratio. All right. So basically what you're seeing here again is the distribution of country years from 1970 to 2011 across industrialized countries. You see that the probability of financial crises is significantly higher in countries where that market bank ratio is high. That is where you have large securities markets. Capital inflows are not significantly associated with financial crises at the lower end of that scale. And you see that also if we think about banks and how risky banks are. This is what's known as the capital ratio of banks, which is how much money do banks keep in the vault for something going wrong. And you see that there's a lot less money that banks are keeping for bad things to go on in financial systems where there are large securities markets, right? So short version of this chart, what happens when lots of money flows in from international finance? It makes banks act more risky, but only in countries with large securities markets, right? So I'm happy to talk about that more, but that's kind of the nitty-gritty quantitative result. So let me just spend a few minutes talking about Canada and Germany, right? So why is it that the Canucks never have financial crises? The conventional wisdom is the picture on the top right, which is Canada has only 5 banks and they're well regulated. And that's true. The problem with that explanation is there are a lot of other countries that only have 5 banks and are well regulated. but they tend to have financial crises, and Canada doesn't. So the real story and what we spend talking about in the book here is Canada has underdeveloped fragmented securities markets in which banks basically get to be boring and stable because they don't face any competition. And why is it that way? It's a kind of fascinating political story, and I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A, of a coalition of miners and speculators and political interests that from Confederation in 1867 all the way up until today basically don't want large national securities markets and have won the political battle to prevent the government from establishing them. So a very interesting political story about coalitional politics and domestic politics and how that has long run implications for financial stability. I will skip that, and we will talk about, ask me more about Canada if you want to hear some of the details. The German story is what happened to boring, stable German banks, right? Germany was Canadian. Minus the nice politics, Germany was Canadian from the unification of Germany in 1870 up until 1990, right? With the exception of the 1931 banking crisis, Germany did not have a banking crisis from 1870 to 1990. Suddenly, since the 1990s, it's constantly had systemic banking crises. Right? So what is different? What's different since the 1980s is Germany now has large securities markets. Right? And again, the politics of this is really interesting. Prior to World War I, Germany was, like the US, on the path to developing large stock and bond markets all the way up to the 1890s. Right? And then there was a series of financial crises, the 1873 to 1896 panic of 1873, long depression. And you got a coalition that didn't like globalization and trade. They didn't like finance. And one of the reasons they didn't like finance was the thing in Berlin run by the Jews. And so you had an interesting coalitional politics argument of German manufacturers, German farmers, the anti-Semitic right in the country that came together, and among the many things they did in this period was regulate and tax and roll back the development of large securities markets. That also, right, continued in the interwar era. Private finance and stock markets were something, along with everything else of Nazi ideology, deeply anathema to Nazi economic ideology. Right, so Germany was on the trajectory to look like the United States. And that stopped between 1896 and 1945. Come the 1980s, the very stable, boring German banks decided that they wanted to get in on the action of globalization, and they lobbied for national regulation and centralization of stock markets, partly because of firms going in the other direction and accessing those stock markets, and German banks wanted to make sure that they captured that business. So this is just a couple of charts to get you a sense of the big change that has happened in German finance here. So if you look in the top left, in 1991, basically 80% of the money financing German firms came from the 5 large German banks, the Deutsche Banks and Commerzbanks of the world. By 2017, that number was down to 50%. Right, and the 50%, where are German banks getting their capital for the other 50%? They're getting it from stock markets, by issuing bonds, by borrowing from hedge funds, those sorts of things. And you see on the bottom chart there, the banks themselves, like Deutsche Bank, getting in on the action. Right, so this is what securities held by German banks and American banks and Canadian banks as a percent of GDP. Right, and so I like this chart. Because it's a good way to show that basically in the 70s and 80s, Germany was Canada, right? And starting in the 1990s, German banks started behaving like American banks with the same predictable financial stability consequences. And the key case of that, as Barry alluded to way at the beginning, is Deutsche Bank. Right, so Deutsche Bank, one of the 5 largest banks in the world, long a stable, boring German bank, kind of the epitome of the stable, boring German bank, started acting like a Citibank or a Bank of America or a JP Morgan in the 1990s, once large securities markets developed in Germany, and since then has been in a constant state of paying fines for illegal violations, for securities violations, bad loans, systemic banking crisis, right? So the kind of epic collapse of Deutsche Bank is illustrative of what's been going on in Germany. But more or less all of the major banks in Germany in the last 20 years now have faced a major financial crisis. So it's a sea change in the way German finance has behaved. Looking at the chat here. Yes, Jordan, that is a good description of Germany here. Will Germany change with Brexit, Sally? That's a good question. Yes, it will, in the wrong direction to some extent, right? So I think a lot of what is going to happen with Brexit is more and more of the securities finance that banks like Deutsche Bank had to go to London to participate in. Now it's going to move to Frankfurt, right? Because the dominant financial center in the Eurozone it's going to move towards the continent. And that may actually have negative consequences for German financial stability going forward, right? And Josh, how does the rise of multinational corporations? It exacerbates this trend, right? So if you think about the incentive for money to move across borders is that production has moved across borders, right? And so these things kind of work in synergy since the 1970s. The reason we opened up the financial globalization in the 70s and 80s is firms that were going to produce overseas wanted finance that was across borders as well. And so multinational corporations kind of link up to that exponential growth in capital flows. Francie, what processes lead? Let me come back to that. That's a very good question. Let me come back to that in a few minutes. And Dan, I will hit this as well when we think about state ownership of banks in developing countries. Yeah, so come back and remind me of those questions in a few minutes as well. All right, almost done. Just a couple things here on, okay, if Mark and David are right, maybe they're not, but if you buy this explanation is helping us understand what causes financial crises, the interesting policy question then is what might work to prevent financial crises? So let me start first with what probably won't work. And here are three things that we think won't work. So one is the story of breaking up the banks. Right. And, I have characters in here standing for this. They're not the only people who advocate these arguments, but this is the Bernie Sanders argument, right? Is the banks are too big to fail and we need to break them up. And that's the solution to financial stability in the United States. I think what we find from our research is that might solve a lot of other problems, right? That very well might address lots of other things like inequality that we care about in the United States. But it's not at all clear that that's going to affect financial stability because of countries like Canada and Germany, where you have very large banks, right? You have the entire financial system is 5 very large banks, and you don't have financial crises, right? So there's something else going on. The other cautionary note is if you look at American financial history, we are a huge outlier. We used to have 30,000 banks, right? And if you look at the history of banking in the 19th and early 20th century, it's a mess, right? We had small fragmented banks and we had constant banking crises in the US. So breaking up big banks and making a lot of small banks may actually be worse for financial stability than it would be otherwise. So breaking up the banks, I don't think is a great idea from the financial stability standpoint. Livia asked about reinstituting Glass-Steagall. That is Elizabeth Warren's solution. That's not going to work either, right? So what is the Glass-Steagall Act? The Glass-Steagall Act was one of the big policy responses along with deposit insurance to the Great Depression. It was in place for 66 years. And the idea was either you could be a commercial bank, which is a regular bank making loans, or you could be an investment bank investing in and underwriting securities, but you couldn't be both. Right. That was repealed under Clinton in 1999. Larry Summers is still paying some kind of political penance for that now. You can be both now. Right. And so Elizabeth Warren's solution is let's reinstitute Glass-Steagall. And again, a couple empirical reasons why I don't think that makes sense is those big banks in Canada and Germany and lots of other countries like Australia and New Zealand that have not had financial crises are both. They are what are known as universal banks that are both commercial banks and investment banks. and they are countries that have had no banking crises. So it doesn't seem to be about the combination of commercial and investment banking. And the reason why, I think, is the market structure problem, right? So as we tried to kind of show in the book, even regular, boring, plain vanilla commercial banks in a system with large securities markets behave in a more risky way, right? So having the firm regulated rather than the financial system regulated doesn't really get at the problem, right? The third solution that's out there, or implication, might be, well, securities markets are too big or global finance is too big. And so you're looking at Danny Roderick, who's one of the world's foremost economists. He's a Turkish development economist, but he also writes about financial crises. This is his argument: is we should have capital controls, we should have barriers to the cross-border flow of finance, or we might think about rolling back U.S. securities markets, right? And those things could help, but there are trade-offs involved, right? So one trade-off is that there's an awful lot of benefits of large securities markets, right? And we can talk about those in Q&A, but also how, right? So if we're going to roll back US securities markets, you're rolling back 150 years of American history to make the US like Canada, right? So that's it's a goal that would work. It's politically unclear how we would get there. And global finance, while it has increased inequality, had a lot of distributional consequences, globalization has also massively increased wealth in the United States and in the world, right? So on those two things, we had a period of the world from 1945 to 1973 where there was basically no global finance. That's what you're looking at in this chart. It was the era when we had no banking crises, right? Lots of banking crises from 1870 up until 1943, basically none until 1970s, and then a ton since then. So we could roll back global finance completely, and that would probably actually work. We wouldn't have a lot of systemic banking crises because there would be a lot less money in the system. We would all be a lot poorer as well, right? And so this is something I talk to my students about a lot with trade-offs, is the era of trade and financial globalization since World War II is an era of unprecedented exponential growth in wealth around the world. It's also an era of unprecedented inequality, right, and distributional consequences, but you kind of can't have one without the other, right? So if we're willing to go back to living standards along the lines of the 1940s or 1950s, we could give up on global finance. But that's a trade-off, and it's something that we should think about seriously when we think about policy consequences. So what might work? And this is kind of the pessimistic note, because politically, this is hard, and it would work, but it doesn't mean that we would get rid of financial crises completely. Is if you want banks to behave in a less risky way, you need to make it so that banks can't behave in a less risky way, which means they need to hold a lot more money in the vault, right? And this is, one of the policy implications that David and I talk about in the book, but probably the person who's most forcefully making this argument that you might have heard of is Anat Admati, who's a professor at Stanford Business School, Israeli professor, book called The Banker's New Clothes, which she wrote, which is very good and I highly recommend. Basically, you can think about this as like speed limits and making banks into utilities. If you don't want banks to engage in risky behavior, then it has to be that they don't have to hold just 5 or 10% of their money in the vault. They probably need to hold 30% of their money in the vault. That is politically really hard, right? But that's probably the economic policy solution. And so the interesting discussion there is how we might build a political coalition to accomplish that. But that would make American banks a lot more stable, even though, right, they're operating in a system that is not like a Canada or not like in Australia or in New Zealand. So that's kind of a little bit on the policy side. Just very quickly on the COVID economic crisis, it's not a banking crisis or a financial crisis, right? It's a pandemic-induced freeze in the economy in which the banks were fine and kind of the economic fundamentals were generally sound. And it's not a debt crisis because interest rates are lower than they've ever been in the history of the world, basically, right now. So governments don't have any problem borrowing. That's the good, because we know that banking crises have those economic and political effects. The bad is, as you know from following the news, is the politics of austerity haven't changed, right? So the Republican Party is basically, ideologically opposed to pretty much any sensible economic policy response to the crisis right now. And suddenly, because Joe Biden just got elected, everybody in the Republican Party has come back to Jesus and found their deficit hawk bona fides again. And one of the reasons the financial crisis in 2008 became a long run crisis is because of the fiscal austerity that we put in place at both the state and the national level from 2010 up until about 2018, right? So that's the good, that's the bad. The ugly is the longer that goes on, right, then it becomes a big problem because state and local governments can't borrow like the US government. And so you can imagine thinking about 2 or 3 budget cycles in Wisconsin and elsewhere with massive budget cuts, right? And if state and local governments are slashing spending constantly, it doesn't matter how big the checks are to households or how big the PPP loans are, we're going to have another recession in a lost decade. And the longer that goes on, then the more people are going to default on their loans, the more firms are going to default on their loans, and the more likely that this thing that is a public health and economic crisis then actually does become another financial crisis. So just a few charts quickly to illustrate that. This is what the current recession looks like compared to the previous one, right? So you see like an actually much larger drop in employment, but very short. So we're back to, quote, only a 6% or 7% decline, but that's like the bottom of the Great Recession, right? So if we solve that quickly in the next year because there's vaccines and there's an aggressive policy response, we're going to be okay. If we don't, probably not, right? And the other thing that goes with that, and a lot of you are probably aware of this, is unlike previous crises, which hit pretty much everybody in the economy equally, this is a really weird crisis, which has enormous inequality inducing effects, right? So look at the bottom right of the chart on the left, highest earning versus lowest earning, and that's tied to the charts on the right. And we all know this because we're sitting in our houses for months after months, buying things on Amazon and not going out or not traveling, right? So who gets hit in this economy, right? Firms have mostly survived. Consumers have mostly survived because of unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, we work from home, et cetera. Who gets hit? It's the service sector, right? And so you see the bottom of the economic scale, people who work in the service sector are devastated right now because of this economic crisis. And so that's something that's really different, even from the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, is how uneven the consequences of this crisis. So it's not a banking and financial crisis yet, which is the good part. The bad part is it exacerbates all of the inequalities that were already worse exacerbated than ever before in American society because of what we've now gone through in the last year. Right. This is just on the cost of borrowing, right? So, and those of you that follow me on Twitter know that I bang on about this all the time, right? Why is austerity stupid? Austerity is stupid because real interest rates are negative, right? So the interest rate on 30-year government bonds is 1.6%. Projected inflation is 2% a year for the next 20 years, which basically means if we give the US government $100 today, 30 years from now, they're going to pay us back in real terms about $90, right? So the US government, which issues the dollar, which is 70% of world foreign exchange reserves, basically is paying interest on its debt lower as a percent of GDP than any time in the last 50 years, and money is basically free, right? So the, economic policy response without politics would be we should be borrowing and spending and just paying everybody to stay home, right? And spending as much money as we possibly can. Obviously, there are politics to that, which is why we're not doing that. But that's kind of the economics of the policy response. And my last slide here, if you don't do that, you get the Great Recession, right? So this is probably my favorite chart of the last decade, which is it's from the Brookings Institution, Hutchins Center on Fiscal Monetary Policy. This is the contribution to economic growth or not from federal spending, state and local spending, and government spending, basically. So what do you see here? Right, you see we had a financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, and for about 2 years, we had big fiscal stimulus from the government. And then what happened in 2010 up until 2018? We basically had austerity, even though the US government could borrow in those unlimited consequences. A ton of that was here in Wisconsin. A lot of that was at federal level. But basically, we turned a really bad financial crisis into a lost decade because of politics. And because, in particular, the Republican Party economically is basically, has become a far right party in terms of its fiscal policy. And that's had negative consequences here and at the national level. So that's kind of the risk on COVID, is it's not a banking crisis. But if the politics of responses to economic downturns keep playing out in the same way, we're going to turn this pandemic crisis of a year or two into something that lasts for 10 years. And that's where probably the election of the last week made a big difference. Right. So the ability of the Biden administration to engage in large fiscal stimulus is a lot easier with a Senate that is actually controlled 51-50 by the Democrats than it was 3 days ago with it in the other direction with Mitch McConnell as the majority leader. So I'll leave it there. Sorry, I went a little bit over, but happy to take questions and whatnot. So thanks a lot.
Mark, can I go back a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to go back to Henry. Henry had asked early on, did capital flows grow at a steady percentage? Would it look like a straight line on a log normal scale?
No, it wouldn't. So it's a big U shape, Hank. Again, so if you looked at, from 1870 to 1914, you had log linear growth in capital flows. Then you had World War I and the interwar period and the Great Depression, and you had the collapse of most of that. And then you basically had, under what was known as the Bretton Woods system, most countries had capital controls. So it was actually illegal to move across borders, and there were a way to evade it. But basically, there were no capital flows in the world economy from 1945 to 1973. And then you had this exponential growth. Right. So it would look more linear if you logged it, but it would be a complete structural break from the 1943 to 1973 period.
There were also some comments about Luxembourg and its banking role and, like for money laundering and tax evasion.
Yeah. So, this is very much an explanation. You can think about countries like Luxembourg, the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Man. Even Switzerland is a small enough. These countries are kind of tax haven financial centers, right? And so their numbers look a little skewed because basically like the entire Luxembourg economy is banking, right? And it's like the entire Cayman Islands economy. So they're kind of outliers on the distribution, right? So if we want to understand, it's a little bit of like, if you want to understand why financial crises happen in countries like Japan or the United States or Canada or Germany, or even a Finland or a Sweden, right? Someone like Luxembourg or the Caymans is too small, right? We know why they have banking crises because it's the only thing in their economy is money. It's 500% of GDP is capital flows into Luxembourg, right? So they're going to have crises just because that's the only game in town. But they're also too small from a policy standpoint. Like they don't matter. If Luxembourg has a banking crisis, it's not going to take down the world economy. If the US has a banking crisis, everybody's in trouble.
And then Livia had mentioned, given Brexit, will the UK influence now change?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So that chart I showed you of this is what the world financial system looks like in 2015 with the US and the UK as the two dominant financial centers. That's been changing since the 1890s, right? I mean, the reason we have a Federal Reserve, and we got a Federal Reserve in 1913, is JP Morgan and the bankers of the era wanted the US to replace London as the world's financial center. And you couldn't do that if we didn't have a central bank. So the U.S. has been kind of trying to take away the world's financial center role from Britain for a century, but these things get locked in, and it's really been both of them for the last 100 years. Yeah, if I had to bet looking forward 50 years, it's going to be the U.S., it's going to be Frankfurt, it's going to be New York, it's going to be Frankfurt, it's going to be Singapore, London. Unless something changes, London is going to go from being one of those three big financial centers. They'll be important like Zurich is important, or like Paris or Toronto is important, but they're not going to be like the global financial center in the way that they are on par with the US anymore. So yeah, I mean, I could talk for an hour about Brexit and why it's a stupid own goal for the UK. But absolutely, like they're going to lose economic and political influence.
And when you made reference to the Continental Bank in Chicago, Scott Forrester had pointed out that their employer at that time was a customer of Continental. They called their loan in, even though they weren't in default, and they took money out of their bank account. And
Yep.
it was, and they were in federal court with Continental.
So thank you, Scott. That's a great thing, because that's exactly how you go from one bank having a crisis to having a systemic crisis, right? And we saw it in 2008 with Lehman Brothers, right? So the fifth largest investment bank, which is invested in tens of billions of dollars in mortgage-backed securities, they go under. And before they went under, they called in all of their loans to all of the other banks and firms in the country. And that's how it spreads from one bank to the entire banking system, and it becomes a real economic crisis. So the U.S. continental Illinois, like we don't talk about it anymore. That's the first time we got more stringent capital regulations, was actually in 1987 and 1988 in response to continental Illinois and a couple other big banking crises. Yeah.
And Lydia followed up, could part of the move to the right be explained instead by the opposition to the refugee crisis?
It's part of it, and it varies by country. But the only other times we have seen this happen in so many countries simultaneously is in the wake of a large financial crisis. So it's a good question, Livia. I would say, the way I think about it is the financial crisis and the banking collapse is kind of the wrapper in which politicians mobilize a lot of things on the far right. So some of what you do is you blame the incumbents in power for screwing workers, right? That's the populist part. The other thing you do is you blame the Jews or you blame the immigrants, right, for causing the crisis. That's the nationalist part. Sometimes those things go together, right? But it's actually striking what you see in the EU is there is far right parties, but the ones that really were anti-immigrant during the refugee crisis were the ones that came to power in the 1990s, like the Freedom Party in Austria, right? The ones that gained traction in other countries were much more making the economic populist argument. And you also had the case of Germany, right? So Germany, right, took in 850,000 immigrants, and the Christian Democrats became more popular. Right. So that has to do with institutions and electoral rules and political systems. But these things are tied together, but it's not, I don't think it's about immigration and refugees. I think it's much more about the economic consequences.
And you might have answered this, but Hank had also said, when COVID was new, have you had any reaction from bankers or policymakers?
No, I mean, so the book came out in April. Right. Sort of like poor timing for a book launch in the sense that, we were interested in financial crises and things like that. And then the pandemic took on everything else. So a little bit, but not too much. I mean, in my corners of the academic world where people talk about policies, it's gotten a nice reception, but it hasn't kind of become a nationally prominent thing. So there were a couple questions here in the chat that I wanted to get to. So one was Dan's. How does it apply in countries in which bank lending is more directly driven by political institutions? So that's something that we looked at, Dan, actually. When David and I started the project, I actually thought the big thing was going to be state ownership of banking and financial repression in conjunction with the capital flows. And honestly, we tried to make that result happen in the data, and it wasn't there. So I think, when you look at a Turkey or in Indonesia in the Asian financial crisis, et cetera, that's another cause of financial crises, especially in kind of lower middle income, less democratic countries, is state ownership in the banking sector leads to cronyism and corruption, and that causes banking crises. That's a lot of what happened in Latin America in the 1980s, for example. But I don't think in advanced industrialized countries, that's what's going on. Francie asked about the political response, why right and not left? And that ties into a little bit what Livia asked about. And there, I think I would say the pattern is really interesting, right? And so I think it is left populism doesn't tend to blame ethnic groups or globalization in quite the same ways as right populism does. And so you do, if you look again, what I showed you with the 1932 election, and you see that a little bit with, Sanders and Warren in the US and kind of more progressive parties in European parliamentary systems, you see some move to the left, right? The German Greens now have replaced the Social Democrats as the number 2 party, and they're kind of the Sanders-Warren equivalent in German politics. But they've taken about 10% of the votes from the middle. The far right has taken, right, in many countries, 20% of the votes. So you see that hollowing out of the middle, but it's an uneven distribution, right? And that's where I think it can get tied in with globalization and migration and ethnicity and refugees, and the far right mobilizes those levers, right? It tells people hit by economic and financial crises, those people are to blame as a group and they're bad, right? Or foreign money or foreigners are bad things. And so the xenophobia and the anti-globalization is more a lever of the right than the left. Josh, Roderick's argument about, yes. So Roderick's argument about rolling things back. Yeah, I mean, Danny's argument is not we want to get rid of finance completely, right? His argument is the modest use of capital controls would roll us back to a sustainable level of economic growth. I'm on board with that economically. The political scientist in me worries about that in the sense of, the same way I worry about protectionism is once you kind of say tariffs are fine, right? The historical evidence is they go to high levels. Once you say, capital controls are fine, everybody starts using them. I worry about the 1929 to 1933 spiral. So, Regina, I have no answer to your excellent question about post-COVID budgeting for the city, other than you should be loudly calling for our representatives and senators to press the US government for taking advantage of these unprecedented negative real interest rates to bail out state and local governments, because that's the key. They have the ability to do it, and state and local governments have hard budgets and don't. Ariel, what about amounts of defense spending? But again, like, we can afford that as the United States, right? So, if we had well-regulated banks, we could not have financial crises, and we could still, because we're the United States, run large budget deficits. So it's there's a very interesting debate, right, where you and I would probably agree on relative allocation of social spending versus defense spending. From a financial stability standpoint, I don't think large defense spending in the United States is much of a problem, right? Jordan's blame the Jewish globalist financier speculators. It's mostly in North America and Europe. I think it would be more the blame the globalist speculators, and who the globalists are is different, right? So this is what happened in 1896, right? So you get a stock market panic in Germany, and the conservative parties and all of the banks and firms which are, sponsoring the conservative parties basically say, all of these speculators in Berlin who are Jewish are the reasons why the stable traditional German banking system is now under threat. So let's tax and regulate the hell out of them so we don't have stock trading in Berlin anymore. And then the Nazis basically do the same thing when it starts to come back in the 1920s. But, you don't need George Soros or the Jews in Berlin, right? All you need is foreign bankers. So yeah, Korea in 1997, right? They blame the Japanese banks and the German banks and the American banks for coming in and lending their banks, who lent out to the real estate sector, too much money, right? So it was all about foreign speculators were the problem, but it wasn't about Jews. There was the Japanese, right? So the long running antipathy there was the Koreans, have views about Japan, and so they become the bête noire. In Latin America, it was the ugly Americans, right? So, the thing we don't like to talk about with the Latin American crisis is Citibank and Bank of America and every bank in the United States was insolvent from lending to Argentina and Mexico and Brazil, right? And that was basically in Latin America, and it still is, right? That was just the Monroe Doctrine and Teddy Roosevelt and the long history of Americans coming in and overthrowing governments in Latin America and causing political and economic problems. So the villain changes, but I think you're onto something definitely about let's blame the foreigner and let's blame the speculators. Not always the Jews, often the Jews, not always the Jews, right? Ziva, about Asian markets, where do they fit in? So with Hong Kong in particular, I mean, Hong Kong is basically, is one of the world's largest financial centers, and up until about a year ago, really was basically, London in Asia. Hong Kong is on the cusp of being rolled up by Beijing and regulated as part of China. So it's not going to be a major financial center if Xi Jinping keeps acting the way he's been going. There's going to be less business in Hong Kong 10, 15, 20 years from now than there is currently. I think the way I think about it with Asian markets is a cautionary tale, right? So there are places like Hong Kong and Singapore, Mumbai, et cetera, that want to be New York, right? That 50 years from now want to have large, complex securities markets like the United States has, right? And as an economic development goal, that probably is a good thing. It's going to bring financial crises, right? So if I live long enough to make it to, the 2070s, which I won't, but the wave of financial crises there is going to be in places like India, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, that are now richer and more developed, and have probably followed the American model instead of the Canadian model. That would be a kind of prediction about that. I don't know if I missed anybody else's questions.
I think I got most of the rest of them. There might have been something
A
from
quick
Josh or
question.
Jordan earlier.
Mark, this is Roz. A quick question. I forgot to note the title of that chart that you had way at the beginning that showed the U.S. and UK in the middle and China off on the side, and they weren't as big. Which kind of surprises me in the way that people say, "Oh, China's coming up and they're going to destroy the economy," whatever. Is there a way for them to currently be hiding some of their transactions so that they don't look like they're coming from China, and then all of a sudden, boom, they're that's the chart. Thank you.
Yeah. Domestically, yes. Internationally, no. It's a really good question. So, because it gets at well, what's in this data? Domestically, absolutely. And it kind of gets to the state ownership question Dan asked, the Chinese government in the last decade to basically keep growth going. A lot of Chinese banks are owned by the state, and a lot of them are insolvent or bankrupt. And the government has quietly been pumping money into them to keep them lending. Because it's basically the government giving money to the arm of the government to lend to the firms that are part of the government because of all the state ownership. That's really hard to track, right? We know that's happening. There's some ways to back it out of Chinese growth data, but we don't really know how bad and unstable is the Chinese banking sector because they're being bailed out by the government. The international side, it's easier, right? So I'm more confident in these numbers because there's two sides to these things, right? So we don't know the Chinese data, but the data from everybody who lends to and borrows from China, right? So it shows up in the UK data, in the Japanese data, in the US data, in the Singapore and Korean data. They're just not that big, right? So China's become very big. You might have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese government is basically providing money to countries in Central Asia and Africa for massive infrastructure spending and things like that, which is basically the government giving foreign aid and Chinese corporations investing in the near abroad. What they're not doing is Chinese banks are not big players in global finance. So I think that problem of things are hiding in the data is absolutely true with China. I'm a bit of a skeptic on China for that reason, because of what I study, that, we're going to look back. It's more likely we're going to look back now 50 years and say China was the Soviet Union or Japan, when we thought they were going to take over the world, than that China is the U.S. taking Germany in 1940, or the U.S. taking over the world and surpassing the U.K. Because they're a middle income country that has an aging problem like Japan, and their system is a financial mess, and eventually that bill is going to come due. So yeah, there's a lot of ugly stuff in that data, but I don't think they're hiding more in the global financial system itself.
Thank you, Mark. Brilliant job today.
Thank you.
We can tell how fantastic a presentation is by the amazing questions. Mark, thank you for making your presentation so approachable. Like from your pop culture fun references and your analogies. I guess for all the accountants and the investors and the experts, as well as the Financial 101 viewers whose eyes glaze over, they're a lot less glazed over with your explanation. And truly, your enthusiasm and your knowledge, it's contagious. So as Alyssa put into the chat room, this is available on our YouTube channel for Beth Israel Center. So anybody who wants to look back at a chart or look back at information or tell somebody else who missed this presentation, it's available. And if you want to try out the recipes, let us know how you like them. Kolot Kavod, Mark. Thank you so much.